I was terminally ill and about to die. My daughter was holding my best friend's arm, and my husband was even as close to them as if they were a real family. My daughter cursed me in a venomous tone, wishing that I would die sooner. Unexpectedly, I was reincarnated. After being reborn, when facing my daughter's behaviors like skipping school, eloping, and attempting to hang out with a disreputable male celebrity, I clapped my hands and cheered. This time, I let her be, but my best friend got worried. She scolded me, calling me a brute. I just smiled and said, "Why are you so worried? Could it be that you're her mother?" "Mom, please, just promise me." I opened my eyes and found Irene acting coquettishly in my arms. Her cute and innocent appearance made me daze for a moment. Irene was an art student, and there happened to be an exam in school that was crucial for her future. So, I refused Irene's request to go to see the male celebrity. Since then, she hated me to the core. No matter how I tried to make it up to her, she refused to forgive me. Looking at Irene's hateful eyes, I felt a dull pain in my chest. But I still hardened my heart and told her to focus on her studies. Finally, my daughter was admitted to a key art university with excellent grades, and at this time, my body organs inexplicably failed, and it was already irreversible. "Mom, why don't you say anything?" My thoughts were suddenly pulled back to reality by this shout. Irene pulled a long face, and when she was angry, she looked exactly like my best friend. My heart tightened, and a trace of suspicion arose in me. I frowned and looked at her. "Mom would like to promise you, but what?" Irene asked eagerly. "I don't know how to tell your dad. Just sign your name." Irene was a bit impatient. She gave me a leave application form, and I signed my name on the paper. After signing it, she took the form and excitedly called my husband. I watched this scene coldly, unable to stop the sarcasm in my heart. Irene had asked for a whole week's leave. I hoped she wouldn't regret it. Because next, the school would invite the most famous traditional Chinese painting masters in the country to teach. The master would pick out a few promising students among them and then hold a master-apprentice ceremony. The future of these selected students would be bright. In my previous life, the master only picked 3 people, and Irene was one of them. Irene had the talent. I hired the best teachers to teach her, and with my supervision, her basic skills were particularly solid. Therefore, it was only natural that she was chosen. Instead of being grateful to me, Irene resented me for spoiling her good deed. After she finished the call with my husband, she received a considerable amount of money. I told Dad that I'm going to another place for training. "You must keep it a secret from me." I gently touched her head and said, "Mom has thought it through. Our baby can do whatever she wants as long as you're happy." "Mom, I love you so much." Irene's eyes lit up, then she hugged me, unable to restrain her joy and excitement on her face. That night, there was an argument in Irene's room. Irene was clutching her mobile phone, her face full of anger and dissatisfaction. "Mom has already agreed. Why do you have the right to interfere?" I brought her the pear soup and then took Irene's mobile phone. My best friend's voice sounded a bit flustered. "Yvonne, Irene is in the stage of entering a higher grade. It can't be delayed. But we can't keep learning like a donkey grinding the mill all the time. We need to relax sometimes." Irene nodded vigorously in agreement. She snatched the phone and said, "Auntie, don't worry about this. I can take care of myself." Irene hung up the phone and couldn't help complaining to me. "Why did you make such a best friend? I'm so sick of her." I was a bit surprised in my heart. My best friend and Irene used to be very close. This time, when I let go and didn't interfere, their relationship deteriorated instead. Early in the morning, my daughter left home with her suitcase. I immediately went to the hospital to do a paternity test with my daughter. When I went to get the test report, the medical staff looked at me with strange and pitying eyes. The results showed that there was no blood relationship between Irene and me. I sneered and then burst out laughing until tears came out. I found that I had lived like a joke. My husband was not really my husband. My daughter was not really my daughter. Then where was my own biological child? Where had she gone? I sorted out my collapsing emotions and forced myself to calm down. finding my own biological child was important, but it was not the time to act rashly. My husband and Irene were both away. I looked at the several boxes of apples at the door and smiled strangely. These apples were sent by my mother from our hometown. They had thin skins and were juicy. Lance loved them the most. She hoped that my husband would treat me better in this way. I poured the apples into a basin and washed them clean, then took out their cores and ground them into powder. I mixed the remaining pulp with the powder and made apple jam and dried apples. And my hands had become red and swollen during the process. I had been allergic to apples since I was a child but couldn't resist Lance's liking. Back then, I was deeply trapped in the lies of love and kept hurting myself. He betrayed me and personally pushed me to a dead end. How could I let such a person live? A few days later, my husband came back from his business trip. He lay tiredly on the sofa. I brought him a plate of dried apples. Lance ate them with great relish and kept praising me. Lance handed me the local specialties. I opened it and saw that it was a designer bag. The corners of my mouth curved up, and I smiled at him. Husband, have you forgotten? I'm not interested in this. Really? Lance smiled awkwardly. I remembered it wrong. He indeed remembered it wrong. It was my best friend who liked designer bags. I couldn't help but feel a bit dazed. What a stupid and disgusting man. How on earth did I fall for him back then? In the evening, Lance brought me a cup of hot milk and watched me drink it. After he fell asleep, I immediately went to the toilet to induce vomiting. My death was definitely related to Lance. Over the years, as long as Lance offered me food on his own initiative, I would eat it to show my appreciation. Lance gave it a nice sounding name, saying it was full of love. I opened the bathroom door and looked up, only to find Lance standing at the door, staring at me fixedly. My body stiffened and goosebumps appeared all over me. Lance opened his mouth and said slowly, Yvonne, is the milk not to your taste? I don't know what's wrong recently. I always feel nauseous and want to vomit. Husband, could I be pregnant? I touched my stomach and asked him with a happy look on my face. Impossible. Lance's expression changed. I frowned. Seeing that I didn't look happy, Lance quickly comforted me. He tried to divert my attention, but he really couldn't find any excuse, so he could only grit his teeth and agree to take me to the hospital. Fortunately, I managed to deal with Lance. Otherwise, I lay on the bed, recalling Lance's creepy eyes, and couldn't help curling up into a ball. In my previous life, when Lance learned that my organs were failing, he forcibly took me home from the hospital. He gave it a nice sounding name, saying that we should enjoy the last days together. Irene and my best friend regarded me as an enemy. My best friend forced me to eat their excrement. When Irene was in a bad mood, she would beat and kick me. I lay on the bed, on the verge of death, with a putrid and stinking smell emanating from my body. My best friend whispered in my ear like a devil, Yvonne, didn't you expect it? It was Lance who poisoned you. I stared wide-eyed, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably, and shook my head in disbelief. Impossible, this is impossible. Seeing my painful and desperate look, my best friend snorted and then walked away with her head held high. I suddenly sat up in bed, gasping for breath heavily, and my clothes were soaked with cold sweat. Lance was woken up by me. He furrowed his brows, looking annoyed all over his face. Yvonne, for no reason at all. Do you want me to sleep or not? I let out a long sigh and looked at him expressionlessly. Sorry, I had a nightmare. Lance muttered a few words and then turned over and went back to sleep. In the morning, on Lance's recommendation, I went to a private hospital and had a thorough physical examination. The examination results came out soon. The doctor pretended to look at the test report and said it was mild gastritis and told me to take the medicine properly. Lance and the doctor exchanged a glance, and then Lance took the prescription and went to get the medicine for me. After he left, the doctor suddenly sighed, Young lady, you should go to another hospital for another checkup without telling your husband. After this incident, Lance didn't dare to act rashly, for fear that I would notice something was wrong. Taking advantage of his unpreparedness, I secretly contacted an old classmate from years ago. I gave the other party the remaining liquid of the milk that I had collected before. Before long, the test results came out. The milk contained the ingredient of herbicide. The content was very slight and not easy to be noticed. However, the human body couldn't excrete it and the toxin would only erode the body step by step. By the time it was discovered, it would be too late. My old classmate advised me to divorce him. I smiled bitterly and said, "Divorce him? I'll die even faster. In this situation, either he dies or I die." Lance was a male chauvinist. He wouldn't even touch the kitchen. Every day, I would use the ingredients mixed with the powder of fruit cores to cook for Lance. He began to have stomach discomfort. I advised him to go to the hospital. But as soon as he heard the word hospital, he would impatiently interrupt me, thinking that I was making a fuss over nothing. I felt a bit sarcastic. Lance was a typical case of having a guilty conscience and suspecting everyone. He felt guilty at the mention of the hospital, for fear that I would remember and go to another hospital for another physical examination. That he was worried that I would discover the truth, call the police, and ruin his future. Irene had been out playing for a few days and finally came home. The innocent temperament on her had faded, and she had the charm unique to mature women. It seemed that she had given her body to that little celebrity. After a while, when the news of the little celebrity's promiscuity broke out, I wondered what Irene would think. I didn't bother with Irene. I just took my love away from her. Without my reminders and protection, she would have to make all the choices for the rest of her journey on her own. When Irene came back, my haggard-looking best friend was following behind her. As soon as my best friend saw me, her eyes were full of indignation and resentment. "Yvonne, Irene is your daughter. How could you let her?" "Shut up!" Irene roared, stopping the words that my best friend was about to blurt out. "What's going on here?" Lance asked in confusion. Irene pouted and hugged Lance's arm, acting coquettishly. "Dad, my painting skills have improved a lot recently." The instructor praised me. Hearing that, Lance was indeed happy. He said with relief, "Irene, Dad will take you out for a big meal." As the saying goes, daughters usually take after their fathers. However, Irene didn't look like Lance at all. I stared at these three people from the perspective of an onlooker, and thus had a strange association. So, I took the hair of the three of them and sent it for a paternity test together. Irene was not Lance's child at all. After cheating for so many years, I'm afraid Lance didn't expect that my best friend had also cuckolded him several times. Right, I handed these paternity test reports to my old classmate. They could be used when necessary. After that, I received a call from the school teacher. I went to the office and found Irene standing in front of the teacher with her head hanging down, silent, and her eyes full of stubbornness. When Irene saw me, she quickly ran to me and took my hand. I forced myself to endure the disgust and didn't shake her off. "Teacher, what's wrong with Irene?" The teacher looked worried and told me about Irene's performance at school these days. Not only her academic performance but also her professional skills have regressed. "I'd like to ask the parents whether Irene has been practicing painting during this period of time or not." Irene looked nervous and couldn't help looking at me. According to my previous life, I would surely have severely reprimanded Irene. Now, I'll be a good mother and only infinitely tolerate my daughter's willfulness. I smiled and perfunctorily dealt with the teacher, but I felt rather guilty in my heart and silently apologized in my mind. With my support, Irene straightened her back and looked at the teacher with a look of contempt. "Humph, just a lousy art student. How much money can one earn in the future? I want to be a star." The teacher was so angry that his face turned red and his neck thickened. His good upbringing prevented him from uttering a single dirty word. "From now on, I don't have you as my student anymore." The teacher waved his hand and asked us to leave. I directly took Irene to go through the formalities and transferred her to the ordinary class. By the way, I told my best friend this good news. "Yvonne, are you crazy?" My best friend's voice trembled, and she cursed me incoherently and then hung up the phone. She rushed over angrily, raised her hand, and slapped me in the face. I was slapped so hard that my head went blank and I fell to the ground. Seeing that I was being bullied, Irene kicked my best friend in the stomach. My best friend curled up on the ground in pain, and a large pool of bright red blood flowed out from under her. She sobbed, "Quick, call an ambulance." Irene stopped me and said resentfully, "Mom, don't make the call. People like her deserve a lesson." I looked anxious on the surface, but in my heart, I thought the scene was really ridiculous. Most likely, what was in my best friend's belly was Lance's child. Without knowing the truth, Irene had killed her younger brother or sister. I wondered what my best friend would think. Seeing that some people came to watch, I finally called the emergency number. Since too much time had been wasted, my best friend's child couldn't be saved. I kindly cooked chicken soup for my best friend, but she poured the chicken soup on me. Irene scolded her for not knowing good from bad. My best friend was so angry that her face turned pale. Because she hadn't told Irene about her true identity yet, she could only vent her pent-up anger and resentment on me. After learning the news, Lance rushed over to comfort my best friend. I pretended to be unaware of anything and went to the bathroom to turn on the monitoring device. "Irene, quickly apologize to your mother and your aunt." Lance was so angry that he blurted out whatever came to his mind and almost revealed the truth. "Why? Dad, why are you so concerned about this woman? My mom is your wife." My best friend said, "Forget it. Don't be angry with the child." Then the two of them began to patiently enlighten Irene regarding her education and didn't forget to belittle me at the same time. Irene simply wouldn't listen. She now thought that I was the person who treated her best in the world. "You don't respect my dream at all. And you?" Irene targeted my best friend and cursed, "It's okay for my dad, but who are you to discipline me?" Slap. The sound of a slap rang out. "Dad, you hit me." Irene left the ward crying, and her voice disappeared completely. Next, it was time for Lance to comfort my best friend. I listened for a few minutes but didn't find any important information, so I pretended to return to the ward. "Yvonne, why didn't you discuss with me about transferring Irene to another class?" Lance roared. It was no wonder that Lance and my best friend were so angry. Because the art class of this school was among the best in the whole country. As my father's granddaughter, Irene had been doted on since childhood. He had pulled some strings to get Irene admitted into it. Now that she was transferred to another class just like that, it was equivalent to cutting off half of Irene's future. What era is it now? If the child likes it, just support her. Seeing their anxious and desperate looks, I felt extremely satisfied. In my previous life, every time I disciplined Irene, my best friend and Lance would jump out and sow discord. "Irene, your mother is too strict with you. Auntie will take you to play." "Yvonne, if the child develops psychological problems, let's see what you'll do." They kept speaking ill of me in front of Irene. As time passed, Irene became more and more rebellious. I hid my bitterness in my heart, thinking that everything would be okay when the child grew up. Unexpectedly, reality hit me hard. After being reborn, I changed my educational mode, and they became what I used to be. Seeing my indifferent attitude, Lance and my best friend could only think of other ways. They went to beg the school teachers, but the teachers had already completely given up on Irene. So they turned to me and asked me to supervise the child's study and education more. After hearing this, Irene had a big quarrel with them, and their relationship became even more strained. Lance and my best friend really had no other way and told Irene about her true identity behind my back. I monitored their every move through the monitors at home. No mother doesn't want her child to become better. "Yvonne has been indulging your temper all the time, Irene. Don't be fooled." However, Irene didn't fall for it at all and didn't believe what they said. She used to be strict with me, and you couldn't bear to see her being good. But after she changed, you still thought she was wrong. Irene sneered, "It's you who are sowing discord between me and my mother. It's really disgusting." After hearing Irene's words, my best friend's eyes instantly turned red. She wanted to reach out and hold Irene's hand, but Irene shook it off in disgust. Lance looked at his daughter with a heavy heart and sighed, "Irene, what on earth do you want? If you are really my parents, then send me to be a trainee." Lance and my best friend really had no other way and could only let Irene pursue her dream. A few months later, Star U Entertainment Company was exposed to the scandal of having unspoken rules for female artists. The little star that Irene liked was also from this entertainment company. What Irene didn't know was that this little star was promiscuous and had no scruples. She was doomed to regret her choice for the rest of her life. I had installed a listening device on Lance. Before long, he went to see my best friend again behind my back. The gasping sounds of them rolling around on the bed rang in my ears, and I almost vomited. I forced myself to endure the nausea and finally heard some important information. A few days later, Lance, contrary to his usual behavior, tried to ingratiate himself with me. We played outside for a whole day. When we were crossing the road, suddenly a car lost control and collided with the car in front. The medical staff quickly carried the injured onto the ambulance. As a result, Lance said his concerns with a worried look on his face. It's just that the world is too dangerous nowadays. Who knows when one might die? So it's better to buy several insurance policies from the insurance company. Lance just found an excuse. After experiencing a car rear-end collision, normally, no one would not be afraid. So I directly fell into Lance's trap and went to the insurance company with him and signed various insurance policies. In order not to arouse my suspicion, he also signed his name along with me. Their plan was thus put into practice smoothly. And I also slightly increased the dosage of the toxin. Lance began to suffer from insomnia, frequent migraines, and his stomach became weaker too. Moreover, on Irene's side, she needed money to bribe people in order to get more opportunities. Lance worked even harder. Under my deliberate adjustment, Lance's health fluctuated. He thought it was just subhealth caused by overwork and didn't take it seriously. Lance promised me that he would take annual leave at the end of the month to accompany me on a trip to Lijiang. The place has clear waters, beautiful scenery, and rolling mountains. Lance had indeed chosen a good place to kill me. We checked into a homestay at the foot of the mountain. Lance ate the breakfast that I had laced with something, and then enthusiastically dragged me up the mountain. He pulled me all the way up, deliberately avoiding other tourists. The thick jungle covered our tracks. I was walking in front of Lance, but I could still feel his creepy gaze. He stared at me as if he was observing the right moment to make a move. I took a few deep breaths and suddenly turned my head, which startled Lance. "Yvonne, what's the matter?" "Husband, I'm tired. Let's take a break." Lance firmly rejected my request. He held my hand and walked a little further up. "Come on, we'll reach the top of the mountain soon. Just hold on a bit longer." Seeing that we were about to reach the top of the mountain, Lance's expression became more and more excited. He grinned silently. He looked at me with malicious eyes without any mercy. Suddenly, Lance's body swayed. His face turned pale, and big beads of sweat rolled down from his forehead. Finally, he couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. Lance covered his stomach, reached out to me for toilet paper, and then crawled to the back of the grass. After a few seconds, a loud noise came from around. I couldn't help but take a few steps back and glanced in disgust. Then I found a snake hanging on the branch beside me. It was eyeing the person in the grass, ready to strike at any time. After a while, Lance staggered to his feet, suddenly retched, and squatted down again. The effect of the fruit core powder was really effective. After such a long time, the toxins had accumulated in Lance's body. Today, I just slightly increased the dosage a bit, and the toxins in Lance's body began to act up. Lance cursed angrily and punched the tree beside him. The colorful snake fell down. "Ah!" Lance screamed and called for my help. Without hesitation, I rushed forward and hit the snake with a stick. The snake wrapped itself around Lance even tighter. Its sharp fangs were firmly embedded in Lance's leg. I was so anxious that I paced around, not knowing what to do. "Idiot! Give me the knife quickly." His usual gentle and elegant demeanor disappeared, replaced by a distorted and ferocious face. The veins on Lance's forehead bulged. He collapsed in a sorry plight in his excrement and wriggled and struggled on the ground. After I had my fill of watching, I nodded as if I had just realized what was going on and quickly handed him the knife. He stabbed the snake's body with the blade, thrusting it hard several times, but it had no effect at all. "I'll go find someone to help you." I found a path where there were pedestrians and then tilted my body and rolled down the mountain. The gravel and bushes scratched me until I was bleeding all over, and finally I hit a huge rock. I heard a crunching sound of bones. After the intense pain, my eyes went black and I passed out. I opened my eyes and found myself lying in the hospital. Beside me was a girl around 16 or 17 years old watching over me. When she saw that I woke up, her eyes were full of surprise. She asked me in broken Mandarin how I was feeling. "My husband was bitten by a snake. He's still on the mountain." I pulled out the infusion needle and rushed out of the ward barefoot. The girl quickly pulled me back and then called the nurse over to put the infusion back on. The nurse gave me a good scolding for being such an unruly patient and told me that my husband was in the intensive care unit. However, the nurse told me a piece of news. Although Mr. Lance was saved, the snake venom damaged his spinal nerve. He may never be able to stand up again. When I heard that Lance had been rescued, I couldn't help but sigh in my heart. Evil people always live long. The nurse saw my dazed look, sighed, and then walked out of the ward. Knowing Lance's miserable situation, I relaxed and then turned my attention to the girl in front of me. It was she who found me unconscious after I rolled down the mountain. "Thank you." The girl smiled shyly, waved her hand at me, and then brought me a bowl of rice porridge. She was a bit thin, and her skin had become rough due to exposure to the wind and the sun, but it wasn't hard to see that she had a good foundation. The girl and I had a very pleasant chat. Perhaps her somehow familiar eyebrows and eyes made me feel very kind, and I liked her more and more. Her name was Tara. She was an abandoned child and was raised by her grandfather since childhood. In order to treat her grandfather's illness, she dropped out of high school at an early age. Your grandfather's illness is not a big problem. In the future, you can study at ease. Leave the rest to me. I decided to help this child as a way to repay her for saving my life. Tara wanted to decline, but under my persuasion, she gritted her teeth and agreed. "Auntie, I'll pay you back the money in the future. Then you must study hard and don't let your grandfather down." After resting in the hospital bed for a while, my body recovered a lot. In order to maintain my affectionate persona, I took care of the unconscious Lance day and night. The medical staff also advised me not to overwork myself. I looked at the woman in the mirror. She was thin and pale, as if she could be blown away by a gust of wind. My best friend came as I expected and angrily slapped me. "You murderer! It must be you. You wanted to kill Lance to get the compensation." My ears were ringing. The ribs that had just been fixed were broken again. My best friend looked down at me arrogantly. She cursed at me while I sat slumped on the cold floor, crying silently. People always sympathize with the weak. Coupled with my staying by Lance's side all this time, they all came forward to defend me. "Stop talking nonsense. That man insisted on taking the remote path. He deserved to be bitten by the snake. Who are you, an outsider, to hit someone else's wife? Are you his mistress? Damn it. Compensation? Could it be that the man wanted to kill his wife but ended up being bitten by the snake instead?" People were talking about it one after another, uncovering the ugly truth, and looking at my best friend with contempt and disgust. My best friend looked flustered and fled in a panic under everyone's scrutiny. However, this hasty escape behavior only strengthened everyone's speculation. A group of people came to comfort me one after another, and some even proposed to call the police. But I still firmly believed in my husband and my best friend and politely declined everyone's suggestions. Lance woke up. My best friend pushed me aside and hugged Lance, starting to sob. "Brother Lance, was it Yvonne who did this to you?" He opened his mouth and made wheezing sounds, with saliva dripping down from the corners of his mouth. Obviously, Lance also realized that he couldn't speak anymore and couldn't even move a finger. After seeing his appearance, my best friend was so scared that she took several steps back. How did he end up like this?" I sighed. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain. Can he still recover?" Not only my best friend wanted to know, but even Lance was looking at me eagerly. "He'll be like this for the rest of his life." The light in Lance's eyes dimmed. He looked at my best friend as if he wanted to say something. My best friend had a pained look on her face. She grabbed my hand and said, "Brother Lance is already like this. You and Irene will have to depend on each other. I'll help you too." Lance trembled all over and looked at my best friend ferociously, but couldn't say a single word. Obviously, my best friend had given up on Lance. After he lost his value, she turned around and tried to play the emotional card with me. Once Lance died, besides the compensation from his company, a large amount of insurance compensation could also be obtained. She hoped that I would continue to support Irene. "Although the doctor said the chance of recovery is slim, I'll take good care of him." Seeing that I wouldn't budge, my best friend cursed me without restraint. "Are you stupid? He's already like this. Why are you still bothering with him?" Nonsense. I hadn't got Lance's money out of him yet. There was no way I'd let him die. My best friend was so angry that she slammed the door and left. From then on, she never came to see Lance again. Under my meticulous care, Lance's attitude towards me softened a lot. Every time I mentioned my best friend, he would look disgusted, as if she was his sworn enemy. Rotten and deteriorated feelings are like this. Once interests are involved, they become extremely fragile. After Lance's accident, I naturally told Irene about it. "Mom, don't call me about this kind of thing anymore in the future." The noise on Irene's side was loud, and her speech was also ambiguous. After chatting with her for a few sentences, she hung up the phone directly. It seemed that Irene, just like her biological mother, was an ungrateful and heartless person and naturally didn't care about Lance's life or death. Hearing this, a turbid tear rolled down Lance's eye socket. He closed his eyes in pain. During this period, I was also busy finding a school for the girl who saved me. Recommended by an introducer, I sent her to the best local private middle school. After a while, Lance had almost recovered. Before leaving, I went to visit the girl's grandfather. The old man was in good spirits and welcomed me into the house cheerfully. He looked me up and down carefully and said something astonishing. "Why did you abandon Tara back then?" I held my breath and slowly turned my head, looking at Tara, who seemed more and more familiar. "Is she my child?" Hearing the old man's words, Tara looked at me at a loss. The old man took out a silver anklet. On the inside of the anklet were written Tara's date of birth and my name. This was the birth gift my father gave to the child. After I gave birth and woke up the next day, I found that the child's anklet was gone. Lance looked flustered at that time and stammered that it was lost. I complained for a long time but didn't think much about it. I had no idea at all that the child in my arms wasn't mine at all. "Mom." My daughter's call brought me back to reality. She had red eyes, sniffed, and looked at me carefully. Hearing this call, my heart almost melted. I hugged Tara tightly in my arms and gently stroked her tense back. Her lovely face was clearly the same as mine when I was a child. My own daughter was right in front of me. She was so sensible, well-behaved, kind-hearted, and caring. I felt as if I had been blind before and wished I could go back to the past and give myself a good beating. I suppressed my excitement and told the grandfather and granddaughter about my experiences over the years. My husband had an affair. My best friend betrayed me. My child was shamefully swapped by them. I had originally wanted to interrogate Lance and my best friend about the whereabouts of my biological child. This accident, however, made me and my daughter reunite. It could be said to be a blessing in disguise. Although I wanted to take my daughter to live with me and take care of her, the current situation wasn't quite suitable yet. I had to give my child a stable environment and let her live a better life smoothly. Before long, I received a large amount of compensation sent by Lance's company as well as the news that he had been fired. Under my comfortable care, Lance became very dependent on me and his mental state also recovered a lot. However, after seeing the news that he had been fired, he still threw a big tantrum. My best friend, like a vulture smelling blood, came to visit Lance with big and small bags of tonics. I gave the two of them enough private space and then turned on the listening device. My best friend had a quarrel with Lance over the compensation. Lance's language function hadn't fully recovered yet and he responded to her words vaguely. "Lance, I must have a share of the compensation. Otherwise, I'll tell Yvonne the truth." With a bang, something heavy fell to the ground. I heard Lance cry out in pain. He told my best friend his account password in a flustered tone. That's more like it. My best friend snorted coldly, walked out of the bedroom, and showed a smug smile. When she passed by me, she deliberately bumped into me and then looked at me gloatingly. Less than an hour later, I saw a text message about a transfer popping up on Lance's phone. I immediately called the police. Is this 110? My husband's compensation has been cheated away. The police arrived immediately. I sat on the sofa, hanging my head low and crying silently. My husband is in poor health. With just that little amount of compensation money, how are we supposed to survive? The police asked me several questions and then called Lance out as well. After Lance knew that I had called the police, he avoided eye contact and was hesitant when answering questions. Finally, under the patient guidance of the police, he fell off the wheelchair, crawled to my feet, and started crying. Yvonne, I'm so sorry to you. Lance confessed that he had an affair with my best friend but still hid the truth about Irene's origin. I was extremely grief-stricken and chose to forgive Lance. This act made the female police officer standing by frown. After getting to the bottom of the matter, the police quickly arrested my best friend. She still smelled of lust. The police also took away my best friend's man by the way and were ready to interrogate the two of them. I deliberately took Lance out to let him see with his own eyes that his woman was in bed with another man. Lance's eyes were bloodshot. He stared at the man with a ferocious look, as if he was going to skin him alive. When my best friend learned that it was I who had called the police, she laughed loudly at me, with envy and schadenfreude in her eyes. She blurted out everything about swapping the children back then. Yvonne, thank you so much for raising Irene for me all these years. As for your child, Lance sold it to human traffickers long ago. Everyone looked at me in shock and pity. I, this unfortunate woman, had raised the mistress's child until she was 18 years old. I didn't even know whether my own child was alive or dead. I felt waves of stabbing pain in my heart. Even if I were given a second chance in life, I still couldn't get over this hurdle. Even if my daughter was safe and sound, I still couldn't calm down my palpitations. If I had been a bit less lucky, my daughter and I would have missed the chance to meet each other. I stared at Lance expressionlessly and then sneered. This laugh made Lance so scared that he fell off the wheelchair and scrambled to get closer to the police. Unexpectedly, I had created a medical miracle. The police looked at me warily, for fear that I would suddenly lose my temper and hurt Lance to death. Lance shouted about getting a divorce, but considering his physical condition, the police still advised him not to do so. Finally, Lance applied for a protection order. The police were also afraid that something might happen to him and approved it directly. This drama hadn't completely ended yet, so of course he couldn't die. The person I hated the most was not my best friend but the man in front of me. He was the root cause of all this. I knew very well what he was thinking. So what if a half-disabled man was found to have sold a child? He applied for a protection order and showed off to me smugly, thinking that I could do nothing about him. The evidence of my best friend's crime was conclusive. And the legal process went very quickly. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Since I took Lance home, he hired a nanny for himself. The nanny took care of everything he ate. I took advantage of this free time to accompany my daughter in Lishue for a while. Thanks to my care, her health was getting better and better. My daughter changed from being shy to becoming more and more lively. When she smiled, she looked so carefree and happy. At this time, I saw the latest entertainment news that the little star Irene liked was arrested for womanizing. Irene quickly called me and asked me to think of a way to help. I said that I didn't have any money and then hung up the phone. Irene called me again, and I directly blocked her number. That night, after I flew home, I saw Lance lying on the ground, on the verge of death, with a broken vase beside him. Lance opened his eyes, grabbed the leg of my trousers with his hand, and muttered, "You unfilial daughter. Go and bring that unfilial daughter back to me." Unfilial daughter? I bent down and smiled at him slightly, then took out the paternity test report from my bag. Lance, Irene is not your child. Lance stared at this paternity test report, his body trembling constantly and his chest heaving violently. He opened his mouth, and finally, his head tilted to one side and his pupils dimmed. Oh dear, this is terrible. How could Irene be so careless and kill her father? I shook my head helplessly and quickly dialed the emergency number and the police number. Less than half an hour later, the emergency medical staff tried to rescue Lance, but it didn't work. Seeing that the situation was not optimistic, they still sent him to the hospital. I was taken to the police station by the police. I remained calm throughout the whole process and told them everything I knew. Miss Yvonne, aren't you sad that your husband is dead? What's there to be sad about a beast who had an affair and sold my daughter? I mentioned that I had been traveling in different cities all the time and had a solid alibi. Therefore, my suspicion was greatly reduced. After forensic identification, Lance indeed died of intracranial hemorrhage caused by his head being hit by the vase. Moreover, the savings at home had disappeared without a trace. The police directly targeted Irene and arrested her. Irene used the money to suppress the news about the little star but also ended up in prison. Just after turning 18, she was sentenced to life imprisonment for involuntary manslaughter. Irene was completely panicked. She vented all her hatred on me, trying to drag me down with her. It's her. She instigated me to kill my father. However, the police had already collected evidence and retrieved the call records between me and Irene. During the calls, I repeatedly said that I didn't have any money and asked Irene to give up the entertainment industry and return to a normal life. Irene simply wouldn't listen to my advice. Since she couldn't get money from me, she went to find the paralyzed Lance. The two of them quarreled over money, and in a fit of anger, Irene directly hit Lance on the head with the vase, which led to his death. I told my parents about this matter. They felt so sorry for what I had gone through all these years. Then, I took my parents to meet their biological granddaughter, and the whole family had a happy meal together. After my daughter finished the college entrance examination, she came to my city to go to university. I got the compensation money back. After Lance's death, the insurance policy he had signed came into effect, and the insurance company transferred a huge sum of money to me. In this life, the three of them got the punishment they deserved. I took the people I loved most to travel all over the world. At night, groups of meteors streaked across the sky, and everyone exclaimed in surprise. My daughter closed her eyes, put her hands together, and made a wish piously. After a long while, she slowly opened her eyes and then looked at me with a smile. I asked curiously, "What's your wish?" My daughter stretched out her little finger and hooked it at me. I smiled helplessly and responded to her. "One big and one small, our two little fingers were tightly intertwined," she replied. "I hope Mom can be happy forever." The end.